Good evening to you all, and welcome to this very special presentation, part of our Staying Connected series. Temple Beth Shalom is very proud of its programs, offering a wide diversity. These have been political, medical, educational, travel, philosophical, and literary. So there's been enormous diversity of programs. Tonight we welcome Ambassador Akiva Tor, who is the ambassador to South Korea. He joins a distinguished line of ambassadors who've addressed us before. We've had Ambassador Stuart Eisenstadt and fairly recently Ambassador Dennis Ross. The presentation tonight will be on Israel and the surrounding world, the way forward. And so it gives me great pleasure to ask Dr. Ben Sachs, our congregant, to introduce Ambassador Tor to us.
So good evening, everybody. I'd just like to thank Ambassador Tor for taking this on. When Al originally proposed it, he and I thought that Ambassador Tor would be back in South Korea and it would be a reasonable time difference. Instead, he's still in Israel, and so it's 2 a.m. Thank you, Akiva. Akiva has recently been appointed to the position in the Republic of Korea, and I leave him to discuss why this is such a vital area of geography for the Jewish community, for Israel and the Jewish community. The role he played up till now has been the head of the Bureau for World Jewish Affairs and World Religions at the Israel Ministry of Foreign Affairs. That's a remarkable position, and under that aegis, he brought together the heads of many, if not most, of Eastern religions: Taoism, Buddhism, Zoroastrians, Hindus, Jains, Shinto, Confucians, and Sikhism. And imagine all of them gathering in Jerusalem, was it about 18 months ago, and then active discussion with leadership in Israel, and then everybody decamped to the King David Hotel, where the chef was charged with coming up with a meal that was super kosher for all of these people from across the world. It was a wonderful meal, but it was really hard. Akiva, as you will tell from his accent, was born and raised in the United States. Actually, he was born in South Carolina, attended Columbia University, where he graduated with a degree in philosophy, and then made Aliyah at the age of 24 and became a paratrooper in the IDF. Later on, he became an infantry captain in the IDF reserves. He's held many important positions. We met because he was a Wexner Fellow in Boston and attended the Harvard University Kennedy School of Government. And when he was there, that's when I met him and his family. Akiva's married to Dr. Naomi Tor, who's a mediator and community social worker on a regional basis in Israel. Naomi is an extraordinary person. She is of Yemenite descent and proud of her heritage. And obviously it's a very interesting mix between a South Carolinian who's been married for many decades to this woman who's of Yemenite descent. They have 4 wonderful children, all of whom I know, and he's just a remarkable family man, has dedicated his life to the state of Israel and continues to do so in very important leadership roles. It is my privilege and pleasure to hand the podium over to you, Akiva.
Well, thank you very much, President Eric Farber and Dr. Ben Sachs. Let's put this on a first name basis, because I'm not the American ambassador, I'm the Israeli ambassador. So I'm Akiva for Temple Beth Shalom this evening. Ben is, of course, modest in his customary way. We met in Boston because he was in charge of all high-risk pregnancies at Beth Israel Deaconess, and therefore he delivered our 4th child. Successfully, I should say. And that's Roni. She's now 18 years old. Our topic this evening is Israel and the world Jewish community. And we can take it to a more global political direction, but that's the topic I actually prepared. So I recommend that I open up the discussion with about 20 to 30 minutes of some thoughts, and then we can open this up for a conversation. And for all the participants, this is truly an internal Jewish conversation in which it's possible to say everything and anything, and you don't have to hold back, and this should be completely open. I should say as well that I'm representing my own personal viewpoints, not official viewpoints of the State of Israel. So that way I can say things which are a little bit sharper and more defined. I'll start with something interesting that happened to me this morning. I'm here in Israel on home leave. I came for Pesach, and I also came to be vaccinated because although the Republic of Korea, which is South Korea, is doing very well in handling COVID per se, there's very little illness in Korea. It's something like 400 to 500 infections a day in a population of 52 million. So it's really very, very low. On the other hand, they're not doing so well in the vaccination drive. Israel's kind of the opposite. So in any case, I came home to be vaccinated, and I was invited to a conversation this morning with our foreign minister, Gabi Ashkenazi, who wanted to hear what I had to tell him about South Korea and our relations and what I needed from him. So we spoke about quite a few things. We spoke about the opportunities for deepening political and economic connection between Israel and Korea. We spoke about the Iranian issue, which is quite acute in East Asia because countries like Korea and Japan, and certainly China, are already thinking about the possible opening of the Iranian economy as a source of petroleum, but also as a huge market for their exports. This is, of course, a challenge for Israel. I talked to him about some of the things that we're trying to do about how to connect Israeli pop stars to Korean pop or K-pop and K-drama as a means of making the Israeli brand stronger there, and what we needed to do in order to open up an air corridor between Israel and Korea. And then at the end of it, I said to him, I said, Foreign Minister, is it okay if I bring up an issue which is not connected to my current job, but rather to my last job when I was in charge of World Jewish Affairs? He said, certainly, no problem. I said to him, we've been sent by headquarters, we've been sent a placard with instructions to hang it in every mission in the world with basically the 7 or 8 major aims of Israeli foreign policy. And I said, on that placard, it does not say strengthening the relationship of Israel with the Jewish people and advancing the welfare of the Jewish people everywhere. And I said to him, he said, well, that's obviously a mistake which has to be corrected, and he wrote it down. So, but this is something that I was wondering about. How is it possible that this was missing from from something that we put up in every mission around the world? Because as a foreign minister said, there's no question that this is a pillar of the Israeli foreign ministry. And so I think I'd like to try to describe why I think this happens and what it means and what we need to do about it. So let's start at the beginning. Israel, according to its own understanding, or as it understands itself in the Israeli Declaration of Independence, is a nation state which expresses the self-determination of the Jewish people. Now, one can raise the question as, okay, so what does this mean in terms of the responsibilities of the Israeli state towards Jews and Jewish communities who are not citizens of the state of Israel? After all, we have many countries which have large diasporas. China has diaspora of more than 30 million Chinese outside of China who are living in countries that are not Chinese in any way. I'm not talking about Taiwan or Singapore. I'm just talking about Chinese communities anywhere. There are Japanese all over the world. Of course, Italians, Irish, Greeks, Germans. What are the relations of those countries with their diasporas? In almost no case do we think of a country as having any responsibility for people who share its ethnicity, but not its citizenship. But we think of Israel and the Jewish people in a different way. And in the Declaration of Independence, it said it doesn't spell out exactly what this relationship is supposed to be. It says that Israel will be open for immigration for Jews anywhere. In other words, any Jew, and this is the basis of the law of return, any Jew anywhere in the world can come to Israel and immediately claim citizenship in the country. It also said in the Declaration of Independence that the establishment of Israel would realize the dream of Jewish redemption. And well, those are big words, and it's a question. It's up to us to decide what that actually means. It's interesting. The Declaration of Independence says that the Yishuv, or the Jewish community in Palestine, stretches out its hands in peace to its Arab neighbors, but also calls on the Jewish communities around the world to rally to the support of the new state, because it was clear that there was an imminent and huge war about to happen. So we have at the very, very beginning the foundational. I mean, the Declaration of Israel was supposed to adopt the Constitution afterwards, and the Declaration of Independence even says that a Constitution would be adopted, but that never happened. And therefore, the Declaration of Independence has become something like not only a Declaration of Independence, but also a semi-constitutional document for Israel. And it essentially says that, well, Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people. Israel will be open for immigration. Israel is realizing some sort of Jewish dream. And there is some sort of responsibility of Jewish communities around the world also towards Israel. So that's sort of just like a conceptual concept, but it's not very clear. And the question is, what is it? What do we do with it? I mean, what are the responsibilities of the state of Israel towards the Jewish community of Sarasota? And what are your responsibilities towards us? Jonathan Pollard just gave an interview to an Israeli newspaper, Israel Hayom, or Israel Today, in which he said that any American Jew working in the defense industry is responsible to give any document that Israel needs for its security. Well, that's obviously an absurd viewpoint and unacceptable, but nevertheless, what are our responsibilities towards each other? So I'd like to take this from the theoretical and try to look at it and break it down into 3 or 4 concrete examples that I've dealt with during the 7 years that I was head of World Jewish Affairs in the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs. First one takes place outside of Israel and outside of the United States, takes place in the European continent. In Western Europe, we've had a situation in the last decade since the security crisis of the early 2010, 2011, before Daesh, but we began to have some Islamic militant terror, especially in France and to a certain extent in Belgium, which caused the rising of a far right or a populist far right in Europe. And the question was, okay, so what should be the relationship of the state of Israel with these parties? Now, it's always been one of my jobs in the foreign ministry was also using the instruments of state for combating anti-Semitism. And it's completely agreed everywhere in the Israeli foreign ministry that that's one of the jobs of the state. In other words, we are a state, and therefore we have to talk to the European Union, and any country where there's an anti-Semitism problem, Israel has to say something. Likewise, there's really never been a question in the Israeli foreign ministry if there is a Jewish community in distress, and there's a government with whom we have diplomatic relations, we're going to talk to that government. And it's interesting because for example, this came up in places like Denmark, and where our ambassador spoke to the Minister of the Interior, of the Chief of Police, regarding security for a certain community here or there. And we were never told by the European minister or the European chief of police, "But out, it's none of your business." They could have said that, but they somehow understand that there's a special relationship between the state of Israel and its Jewish communities and our responsibilities. And generally, the relationship along those lines has always been collegial. But we ran into some challenges. For example, Israel boycotts the National Front in France. We do not talk to the party of Marie Le Pen. We don't talk to AfD, which is Alternative for Germany in Germany. And we certainly don't talk to any of the neo-Nazi parties like Jobbik. We'll never talk to them. But we ran into a problem in 2017, 2018, when all of a sudden in Austria, which is a parliamentary system like Israel, the Freedom Party succeeded in the elections and became the senior coalition partner of the Christian Democrats. Now, this was a government in Austria which was very, very pro-Israel, very friendly to Israel. And all of a sudden, we have a party which is, by the way, also had the foreign ministry. So the foreign minister was from the Freedom Party, which is a party with Nazi roots. In other words, they claimed that they were no longer anti-Semitic, but it was obvious to us looking at the party that there was a strong nostalgia for the Nazi period, or pre-World War II, maybe not all elements of Nazism, but they had all kinds of things like Christmas cards, which were pictures of Wehrmacht soldiers sending messages home, and a lot of very ugly things. Now, the Jewish community of Austria was dead set against, the organized Jewish community was dead set against any connection with the Freedom Party. There were different parts of the Jewish community which were in favor of a relationship with the Freedom Party. And the Israeli Foreign Ministry took a very strong stance against any contact with this party, even though we had to argue with some of members of the Israeli Knesset who said, "Why are you being holier than the Pope? These people are pro-Israel. Why are you checking their tzitzit?" I was very happy that the position against any sort of relationship with the Freedom Party it prevailed in the end. That party, by the way, ended up imploding through. You can read about it in Wikipedia. They got into a whole. The head of the party spoke to some woman in Ibiza, and I don't know who did it, but anyway, it was a whole scandal. They ended up being thrown out of government in the end anyway. But they were looking very, very hard for a relationship with Israel. They wanted Israel to give a kosher stamp. And we found ourselves, by the way, it was a difficult situation because it turned out that Israel was the only country in the world actually boycotting this party. The American government did not boycott them, nor did any of the European governments. Now, the British and the Germans and the French very much wanted us to boycott the Freedom Party. They couldn't do it themselves because they had to deal with them in Brussels, and they wanted Brussels to work, so they could not talk to the Austrian government. But I think that we did our part. In other words, I think in this case, Israel really did its job in terms of being the state of the Jewish people, not only expressing self-determination, but also expressing a specific Jewish value regarding racism and also regarding anti-Semitism. There are cases where we've done less well. It could be argued that Israel is quite close to the Orban government in Hungary. The Orban government it's also a very pro-Israel government, but they've had a problem with Holocaust revisionism. And they certainly, well, Orban believes in democratic illiberalism. So we haven't always been perfect, but I think that some of Israel's positions in Europe in the last decade have been fairly remarkable and have been an expression of a very deep kind of contractual relationship with the Jewish world. These are issues that American Jews are not always so aware of because they're so European. Of course, it'll be a big question. What happens if Marine Le Pen wins elections in France? What will we do? I think it'll also be a question for French Jewry. What will they do? So that's one example. Now to go to something closer to home and something which I think we'll talk about during the question and answers or the discussion period. What about Israel's relationship with the religious streams of Judaism? So here we have a situation, we have a dysfunction which I think results to a large extent from history. This is something very interesting. President Reuven Rivlin, who is now coming to the end of his term in Israel, he spoke about the evolution in his own worldview regarding Reform Judaism. He described himself. I had a number of conversations with him, but afterwards he spoke about it quite publicly. He said, he grew up in Jerusalem as a Jabotinsky family, very, very secular, very Jewish, very Zionistic, but very secular. And he grew up in an Israel where essentially he understood that Zionism or the Zionist movement was in many ways a rebellion against religion. And as a result, we had a situation in Israel where people were either secular or religious. Later on, when the Jews came from the Arab countries, there was much more of an element of sort of like a traditional, but nevertheless, he understood it as this kind of split. And President Rivlin never met, until his adult life, a reformer conservative rabbi. And when he encountered it, it struck him as something very strange and very odd. And in his own view, it was hard for him to even recognize it as authentically Jewish, even though he's completely secular and doesn't keep mitzvot. And he explained how he educated himself by transporting himself through his imagination to the American experience, in which case his family would not have come from Europe to Jerusalem, but rather would have come from Europe, perhaps to New York City, maybe sometimes in the 1880s or 1890s, in which case it's very likely that he would be a reformer conservative Jew today because American Jewry was influenced by the religious infrastructure of 19th century German Jewry, which produced certain structures within Judaism which were not secular, but neither were they Orthodox. So we have this kind of disconnect where the experience of Reform and conservative Judaism is not understood as a first-hand experience among Israeli Jews. And I think that the way that Judaism is experienced in Israel is not fully understood or experienced by American Jews living the American Jewish experience. So the question is, okay, what do we do with this? So I want to start up by saying that there are some elements of the current situation in Israel which go past this historical explanation. It has to do with politics in Israel today, in which we don't have a presidential system. We have a parliamentary system, and therefore every government has to be a coalition. And almost, except for one government in 2015, most governments in the last 20 years have always included the ultra-Orthodox parties. And this has caused a situation of discrimination against Reform and conservative Judaism. I won't even try to justify this. I don't think it can be justified or should be justified. In my own view, I don't think that I would prefer, I know that this is being recorded, I prefer that this not be printed in the paper. So may I please say that this is off the record. I don't think that Israel's leadership believes that it's justifiable. I think the idea that there's no formal standing for non-Orthodox rabbis in Israel is something that cannot stand and should not be, and is completely unjust and has to be fixed. But there is another side though as well, and I think that sometimes in this debate about the place of the streams in Israel, where the streams are right to argue that their communities in Israel have to be funded and have a right to funding, and they go to court over it and they generally win in court. But there are also parts of this argument where I think that there's a lack of understanding of the Israeli situation. A lot of the debate about what should be the situation at the Kotel, I think, in my view, is reflective of this. I know many women from the leadership of the Women of the Wall, and I think that they've achieved quite a lot in the 3 decades of their struggle. But some of the things that they want, I don't think are correct. For example, to fully liberalize the means of tefillah on the main Kotel Plaza is, in a way, and perhaps I'll anger people in this conversation, but that's okay, and you can be angry at me back. I already see Ben not very happy, but I think that not to understand the sentiment of the tens of thousands of ultra-Orthodox Jews who have been there for a century, 24 hours a day, and the way they understand this place, and what the Israeli government needs to do in order to manage this place, is also to a certain extent not to understand reality, or it's a little bit of a lack of pluralism towards the ultra-Orthodox. The plan, which in my view needs to happen, is a place called Ezrat Yisrael, which is the southern Kotel. It's a place next to the Kotel, but it's not iconic like the traditional plaza. This is a place which has been developed for egalitarian and also women's minyan prayer. And I think that's a fair compromise, and that's a compromise which the Israel Supreme Court, which has heard the case 3 times, believes in. But this is sometimes a flashpoint, and sometimes it's been my sense that I think that sometimes American Jews are not being sufficiently sensitive to what things are like in Israel and what it means to be, what it means to make room for our ultra-Orthodox minority, which is at the end of the day 15% of the population. The last thing I wanted to talk about was, well, actually the second to last thing, then there's the issue of political sentiments. And here we have, I think maybe the most painful part, and that is where American Jewry is largely a liberal American Jewry. At least maybe 75% of American Jewry is voting for the Democratic Party. And whereas in Israel we've had now, even though we have a divided public in Israel, but nevertheless we've had pretty much conservative governments for the last 10 years. Before that, we had non-conservative and left-leaning governments, and that could happen again. But nevertheless, I think most sociologists of Israel would say that the Israeli public has gone more in a rightward or conservative direction in the last 10 years. And the question is, so what does this mean for the relationship between Israel and the largest Jewish community outside of Israel, which is basically North American Jewry, because some of the Jewish communities in other parts of the world are not as liberal as American Jews, in some parts of Europe, for example. Well, I think that this is a challenge for all of us, but at the same time, I do think that we have to realize how we look at things. On the one hand, Israel is developing demographically in a certain way. It's becoming more religious. The American Jewry is maybe becoming less religious. Israel is affected by its location in the Middle East, by an ongoing security situation that mitigates how we view things. The American Jewish experience is shaped by the fact that liberal values are the very values which have made the American Jewish success and the American Jewish way of life possible. But I think even at a deeper level, we have to realize also that American Jewry, at the end of the day, is an ethnic religious community within a country. And Israel is a country. And there are differences in the way that these kinds of political entities express themselves or come to value decisions. I think that sometimes states are required to do things that are cruel. It's the nature of being a state, maintaining borders, expelling people, not allowing people to enter, taxation, harsh laws. These are things that ethnic communities don't even have to think about. So there's a difference in the modalities of our experience, and it's not a full explanation of the liberal conservative split, but it's something to think about. Finally, I want to come back to what I believe. Look, I believe that Israel is absolutely obligated to take action and to conceive itself. I think the fact that our placard in the foreign ministry did not contain the line about responsibility for the connection with Jewish communities around the world, I think that's scandalous. And if it gets into the paper, it wouldn't bother me. But anyway, and I hope our foreign minister will fix it. But to me, it's clear that Israel has responsibilities. Israel is something very unique in history. And Israel, even though Israel is less wealthy than American Jewry, first of all, it's quickly catching up, although it will take some time, but it's less wealthy. But nevertheless, it's the one place in the world where Jewish power is exercised by the polity, where there's a government which is primarily Jewish, which has powers of internal taxation and can compel people even to join the armed forces. In other words, it's the one place in the world where Judaism is not voluntary. It's a political principle of government. And to me, that means that it's clear that Israel has responsibilities for the general Jewish welfare in a way that no Jewish community has. Of course, American Jewry, I think, has great responsibilities towards Israel. American Jewry has surely shown that in the many decades of Israel's life through its support. Maybe we're going into a situation where the relative strength of the communities in terms of their ability to act Jewishly has changed. But that only strengthens the argument that Israel has to be more sensitive and more proactive and more listening and more open and more imaginative about how Jews live in other places. The question is, so how do we go about it? First of all, I do think that American Jews have to think about, certain issues. Let's put Iran on the side. Let's put that on the side for a minute because it's too complex. I think that we have to try and find. I think we have to try to find a way to bridge between us, certainly at the level of young leadership. An idea which I wrote about many times and which is coming to some sort of fruition right now under Israeli government is idea, for example, birthright. Birthright was a brilliant idea, but what comes after birthright? Well, I think we need birthright for adults. I think we need to create avenues where every adult American Jew or Jew from anywhere in the world should have the opportunity to visit the state of Israel as a gift of the Jewish people. Another idea could be the establishment of a Peace Corps, a Jewish Peace Corps, a Peace Corps of the Jewish people, in which young Jews and young Israelis, in the case of young Israelis, not only young Jewish Israelis, also 25% of Israel's population is non-Jewish. It's Arab and Druze. But young people from both Israel and from communities around the world doing something in the third world together and training in a school of development in the Negev beforehand. Of course, it wouldn't be for everyone, but it would be an elite principle which would generate a new kind of Israeli and American Jewish leadership of a very high quality, which knows each other through a formative, values-driven experience. Anyway, these are just some ideas, and I think we need to think about more. But maybe let's wrap up here and open this for a conversation. Ben, open. You're muted.
That's a story of my life, Akiva. I would like to start by leading on from the conversation about the Peace Corps and engaging young people from Israel and in the United States and other Jewish communities around the world. But from my time that I lived in Israel, it was so clear to me that many, if not most Israelis I encountered, unless they'd studied in the United States or spent some time there, had any idea about the Jewish community in the United States. So it's not just an ignorance and an alienation of young American Jews from Israel, but also a feeling that I got that Israelis had very little understanding about life, Jewish life in the United States. How do we fix that?
I'm not sure. You know, there are some people in Israel who talked about a reverse birthright, but I don't think it's a good idea. First of all, it'll end up causing tens of thousands of Israelis to leave Israel. And I really can't see Israeli government and world Jewry raising philanthropic millions for that purpose. Ben, I don't want to say this in a way that'll sound offensive. I think, first of all, I think it's obviously we have to teach something in the Israeli education system, but it's a problem to teach the diaspora experience in a way which will be compelling for young Israelis. It's a difficult story to tell, especially since Zionism believes that the ideal way for the Jews to realize their Jewishness is within a Jewish polity. I don't really have the answer to it.
Okay, we have a question. How do you think Israel has survived for 73 years without a constitution?
The reason Israel was, it soon became clear that it would be very difficult for Israel to form a constitution because the ultra-Orthodox parties would not agree. They had a huge problem with the very notion of a constitution because the Jewish constitution, in their view, is the Torah. But Israel's managed actually not badly because what's happened is, based on the Declaration of Independence, we have a strong judiciary and a strong, kind of a hybrid legal system, but nevertheless very professional and very capable, which has developed over the years a series of basic laws, which have formed the core of Israeli jurisprudence. So within there is equality, human dignity, Israel is a Jewish and democratic state. So we have a whole list of principles that are core principles that there cannot be legislation which violates them. So I think that's what's happened is that it's true that we don't have a constitutional document and that causes problems, but we have these basic laws and we have a very strong Supreme Court. The Israeli Supreme Court is stronger than the American Supreme Court. It can strike down laws immediately. There's no override clause. There are people in the Israeli Knesset who want an override clause for the Knesset to be able to overrule the Supreme Court, but right now, that's not the case. So the way that Israel has managed without a constitution is through an exceptionally strong judiciary and normative basic laws which have gained a lot of acceptance and are accepted in the society.
So one of the attendees points out that he's Jewish, his wife's Jewish, his daughter is Jewish, but takes umbrage, is really outraged that the ultra-Orthodox community dictate who is a Jew, and sometimes do this violently. I would add on to the question the behavior of the ultra-Orthodox in Israel during the COVID pandemic, or their behavior perhaps even in New York, leads one to be upset with them. And although I understood you saying correctly that we need to respect their point of view, but have they gone too far? Should this be constrained at this point? How can Israel survive having 15% of the population who ignore basic public health regulations and puts the whole community?
So I think this is too strong a statement of a description of the case. I heard an interview last week by Roni Numa. Roni Numa was an Israeli army general who was tasked with public health guidelines in Israel, and there was some criticism of him that he was too soft on the ultra-Orthodox. But I heard on this interview, he said, look, I think that the rest of society is being overly harsh. It's true that there were parts of he said, first of all, the ultra-Orthodox in Israel are by no means monolithic. They divide into Hasidim, Lithuanian Ashkenazim, and Shas type Sephardic religious. And each community behaved differently. Some were very strict about the guidelines, and it's not fair to paint them all with one brush. Another thing he said is that the experience that they live in is not the experience that the rest of Israel lives in. There are large families in very small apartments, very, very crowded situation, where the spread of COVID within families can hardly be prevented. In any case, I don't think it's helpful for us, and I would venture also for American Jews, to say that part of our population is not behaving properly and to just condemn them in a certain way. I think there are brothers and sisters, and we're going to have to find a way to overcome this and deal with each other. And it doesn't mean that there aren't things that we don't have to be angry about and have a very, very deep argument and fight and struggle. But nevertheless, there are brothers and sisters. And in Israel, we certainly can't forget that. I think that's one of the good things in Israel, is that we can't forget it. We can't walk away with each other. We're stuck together. Regarding who is a Jew, who is a Jew is not only an ultra-Orthodox issue. It's true that they have a very, very strong position on it, but this has been an explosive question for all Israeli governments. How do we define the boundaries of the Jewish people? And I think this will continue to be an issue. It's an issue in Israel, where we have 400,000 emigres from the former Soviet Union who are not formally Jewish. And Israel has not found a way to convert them, which is, I think, ridiculous. But nevertheless, within the Israeli law, I think the definition that resonates the most for the great majority of Israelis is the child of a Jewish mother is Jewish. And look, that's a halakhic ruling, which did not hold in biblical times, but it has been the Jewish norm for at least 1800 years. At the same time, Israel recognizes conservative and reform conversions carried out outside of Israel. The rabbinate controls marriage, and therefore they won't marry people who have not undergone an Orthodox conversion. But any such person can come to Israel and become a citizen. My own view is I think that within Israel there needs to be we need to go back to the model of the Ne'aman committee, which was a committee in the 1990s, which had a model for conversion, in which conversion was carried out through a court which met the Orthodox standard, but training for conversion could be carried out in conservative and reform institutes. In other words, within Israel, I think we need to find a gateway into Judaism which will be halakhically liberal, not halakhically stringent, but halakhically liberal in the sense of being halakhic, but being friendly halakhic, working together with all of the streams together. But within Israel, we should have one gateway for how a person joins the Jewish people formally.
So I had a question. Somebody poses, do you think the two-state solution is still alive or is dead?
Well, dead is too strong a word. In the current Israeli, right now, we don't have a constitution, but we're in the middle of a constitutional crisis in Israel because we can't form a government. But significantly, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not an issue in the current Israeli elections. And the proof of that is that it's conceivable that there will be a coalition government made up of the right, two right-wing parties and two left-wing parties together, and they might well be able to do it, which means that they're not arguing, or the issue of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not first and foremost, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to form such a government, because they wouldn't be able to agree regarding the position in the West Bank or Judea-Samaria. Like right now, we have a situation where we have a weak Palestinian leadership in the West Bank under a very decent leader, but a leader who has not held elections in 14 years, Muhammad Abbas, and he's not able to offer in Israel a deal that they will be willing to accept. And Israel has frankly not elected governments that have been willing to offer the Palestinians a deal that they'll be willing to accept. I think that the deep challenge is that if we look at the authentic Palestinian position, Palestinian non-Hamas position, and the authentic mainstream Israeli position, we've now arrived at a situation where the maximum that Israel believes that it can safely offer does not meet the minimum that the Palestinian leadership believes that they can accept, which is a deadlock. At the same time, though, we do have a functioning Palestinian Authority, which is a Palestinian self-government, which is running 6 of the Palestinian cities and 40% of the territory in the West Bank. And Gaza, as we know, is entirely under the control of Hamas. So the Oslo process moved us in the direction of separating between the two and Palestinian self-empowerment, but it's stuck in a middle position. Whether we'll remain in this situation or evolve towards something more formal, like a two-state solution, I don't know. I don't know what will happen. Right now, it seems to be, it's a somewhat, it's not a perfect situation, but it's a manageable situation. The level of violence is low, and the level of violation of human rights is not high compared to everything else going on in our region. So I wouldn't say that the two-state solution is dead, but I would not say that it's at the top of the agenda right now.
So let me read you what I think is a thoughtful question. Do you agree with the prevailing narrative that the upcoming generations of US Jews are distancing from Israel, or rather their relationship is more nuanced and complex than that of their parents and grandparents?
My own view, look, I served as consul general in San Francisco between 2008 and 2012, and I engaged very, very deeply with that wonderful Jewish community in the Bay Area. But look, it's true that there is distancing among certain parts of young American Jews, but I think that's a misstatement of the situation in my view. In my view, the distancing from Israel is primarily just another expression of distancing from Judaism and Yiddishkeit. In other words, you can't expect anyone to be closer to Israel than they are closer to being Jewish. And I think that's the real problem. The real problem is that the young generation is less Jewish. There certainly can be distancing, but in my opinion, that's the true source of the malaise.
So I think we've got time for a couple more questions, but one member of the congregation clearly wonders about the validity of J Street. What is Israel's position about J Street versus Aipac?
Look. There's different positions. There have been different positions of Israeli ambassadors in Washington. Some Israeli ambassadors in Washington have engaged with J Street, others have not. J Street. Look, obviously, any American Jew who is Zionist and pro-Israel is a party to any part of the conversation. I do have to say, though, that when we have certain issues that are, look, there can be a debate in Israel as well regarding what is the appropriate policy towards Iran and what should be the view regarding the JCPOA, which is the agreement that the United States government formed with a number of other governments regarding normalization of ties with Iran in exchange for freezing of enrichment. But I do think that organized American Jewry it's appropriate to take a very, very cautious, to be very cautious about going 180 degrees against the Israeli government on a position which the Israeli government views as inimical to our national security. I think that becomes a real problem. I mean, so look, J Street has a right to behave as they will. And I'm not saying that my own view is that we should engage with every American Jew who is not anti-Zionist. And I don't think that J Street is anti-Zionist. But it bothers me that they take a position which is so at odds with the view of Israel regarding a national security issue, which is not a human rights issue. It's not a human rights issue. It's not like the debate over the territories. It's a debate about how to handle a nuclearizing Iran. And in my view, it's not appropriate for an American Jewish organization or lobbying group to exercise power in that way, contrary to the view of the Israeli government. That's my opinion.
So as we wrap this up, and thank you, Akiva, is there any last thoughts that you would have for us about the relationship between Israel and the Jewish diaspora, or about how you think the politics in Israel is going to evolve over the next few weeks? Any nuggets of inside information?
There's no such thing as inside information. There's only the prophecy of fools and babes. Look, what I think is the following. I think look, Israel's going through a very difficult last 2 years politically, and I think it's going to require us to probably ultimately make some sort of corrections in the way that we elect governments, because what worked for 70 years is not working. I mean, look, that's just something that I think. I don't know exactly what's going to be. I think that we have to be past that. What I would say is, I would hope that Temple Beth Shalom, number one, will continue to be an extremely successful synagogue. Number one. Number two, if you can't stand the Israeli government, then engage with the Israeli culture. In other words, I think it's very important that the synagogue have an Israeli book club, that there be possibilities for learning the Hebrew language, that you have Israeli film night, that you engage not only with the Israeli government, but with the fullness of Israel. Just like it's our job to engage with you. And I think that you have all the capacities for doing that. And most important thing is that you be a successful Jewish community. That's more important than anything else.
Akiva, we are just a couple of minutes from almost the hour. This is 3 a.m. and I'm sure that you would like to get some sleep tonight. So I'm going to hand off.
Sleep is a waste of time. Sleep is a waste of time. But I do have a 7 a.m. meeting in Shoeva, so I do have to get up at 6. So,
Eric, I'm going to pass the baton to Eric Faber, our president. Eric?
Akiva, thank you so much for an absolutely wonderful evening. I was also thinking it's 3 o'clock in the morning and you are hale and hearty, and I hope this is emblematic of Israeli ambassadors all over the world. Thank you for your good wishes for Temple Beth Shalom. We proudly ally ourselves with Israel. In fact, we do have Hebrew classes at our shul, and there is a Jewish film festival in Sarasota which shows Israeli films. On behalf of our entire congregation, I'd like to thank you for a very thoughtful and inspiring evening, because you've touched on many subjects that we all think about. And to me, one of the most important topics which you really stressed is the role, the responsibilities of Israel to Jews in the diaspora and vice versa. This, to me, is an important issue, one of the most overriding issues today. So thank you for drawing attention to that. On behalf of all of us, we wish you continued success, and we know that the embassy in Korea is in very good hands. So I hope in future you will come back and speak to us again, and we all send very best wishes to you and your family. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm certain that of the 42 participants, someone must be burning mad. And I'm happy to continue this conversation by email, and I would welcome it.
Thank you very much. Good night.
Shalom, kol tuv.
Kol tuv, shalom, shalom.
Good night.